When people talk about Neymar now, one phrase follows him everywhere. Wasted potential. It's almost become part of his name. But there's a problem with that argument. Before we decide Neymar wasted anything, we need to remember just how much of that potential he actually fulfilled. Because Neymar wasn't some wonder kid who never became world class. He absolutely did. At Santos, the hype around him was ridiculous. Brazil had produced generations of extraordinary attacking players, but Neymar was being talked about as the next one before he'd even left South America. And unlike plenty of teenage sensations, he delivered. The tricks got the attention. The rainbow flicks. The stepovers. The outrageous confidence to try things most players wouldn't even attempt. But underneath all of that was a seriously productive footballer. Goals. Assists. Match-winning performances. And in 2011, at just 19 years old, Neymar helped Santos win the Copa Libertadores for the first time since Pelé's era. This wasn't just a kid collecting millions of views with skill compilations. He was deciding major football matches. Europe wanted him. Real Madrid wanted him. Barcelona wanted him. And eventually, in 2013, Neymar chose Barcelona. This was the test. It's one thing humiliating defenders in Brazil. It's another arriving in Europe and sharing a dressing room with Lionel Messi. If Neymar was ever going to be exposed as nothing more than hype, this was where it would happen. Instead, he got better. And when Luis Suarez arrived a year later, Barcelona suddenly had something ridiculous. Messi, Suarez, Neymar, MSN. Three completely different forwards who somehow fitted together almost perfectly. In the 2014-15 season, they scored 122 goals between them as Barcelona won La Liga, the Copa del Rey and the Champions League. And Neymar wasn't just along for the ride. He scored in both legs of the Champions League semi-final against Bayern Munich. Then he scored again in the final against Juventus. He finished that Champions League campaign with 10 goals, level with Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo as the competition's joint top scorer. Think about that. At 23 years old, Neymar had just won the treble and finished alongside the two players who had dominated world football for years. This wasn't potential anymore. This was proof. And Neymar kept producing. In 2017, Barcelona found themselves 4-0 down to Paris Saint-Germain after the first leg of their Champions League tie. The comeback looked impossible. Barcelona won the second leg 6-1. And while the famous photograph from that night is Lionel Messi celebrating in front of the supporters, look at what Neymar actually did. 2 goals. An assist for Sergi Roberto's winner. And when Barcelona desperately needed somebody to make the impossible happen, Neymar took control. By now, the question surrounding him had completely changed. Nobody was asking whether Neymar could become one of the world's best players. He already was. The question was what happened next. Messi was approaching 30. Cristiano Ronaldo was already in his 30s. Neymar was only 25. For years football had belonged to those two giants. And standing immediately behind them was the Brazilian who seemed perfectly positioned to inherit it. He'd conquered South America. He'd conquered Europe. He'd won the Champions League. He'd won the treble. And he'd finished on the Ballon d'Or podium. If Neymar had simply stayed where he was, nobody knows how the story would have ended. Because in the summer of 2017, he made a decision that changed not only his career, but the way millions of people would eventually judge it. In August 2017, Paris Saint-Germain paid €222 million for Neymar. It remains the most expensive transfer in football history. But the money isn't what makes the move fascinating. It's what Neymar walked away from. Barcelona. Messi. Suarez. A team he'd already conquered Europe with. And at just 25 years old, Neymar wasn't escaping a failing club. He was leaving one of the best situations in football. So, why? One explanation has followed him ever since. Neymar wanted to escape Lionel Messi's shadow. Become the main man. Win the Ballon d'Or. Except Neymar himself denied that. He said money wasn't the motivation either. His explanation was simple. He wanted a new challenge. And PSG offered him one. They wanted to win the Champions League for the first time. And Neymar wasn't being signed to help somebody else lead them there. He was supposed to be the difference. Looking back, it's easy to say this was the moment Neymar ruined his career. But in 2017, it didn't look that ridiculous. He was 25. Already one of the best players in the world. And now an entire superclub was being built around him. Maybe this wasn't Neymar running away from greatness. Maybe he thought this was how he'd create greatness of his own. And initially, it worked. Neymar was sensational. Goals, assists, skills, more freedom, more responsibility. By February of his first season, he'd scored 29 goals in 30 appearances. Whatever else you think about the PSG move, Neymar hadn't suddenly become a worse footballer. Then came Real Madrid. PSG lost the first leg of their Champions League tie 3-1. But the return was in Paris. This was exactly the kind of night Neymar had been bought for. Except he never played in it. Against Marseille, days before the second leg, Neymar landed awkwardly. A fractured metatarsal. His season was effectively over. PSG went out without him. And suddenly the first crack had appeared in Neymar's grand Paris plan. Not because he'd lost his ability. Not because the gamble had already failed. But because for the first time in his career, his body had taken him out of the argument. That fractured metatarsal wasn't an isolated setback. It became a pattern. Neymar would return, start looking like one of the best players in the world again, and disappear. Foot injuries, ankle problems, muscle injuries. By October 2019, barely 2 years after joining PSG, injuries and suspensions had already kept him out of roughly half their matches. And that's where the story of Neymar at PSG gets distorted. Because people often remember Paris as the place where Neymar declined. But when he actually played, he was still brilliant. He scored. He created. He became more of a playmaker, dropping deeper and controlling games rather than relying purely on the explosive football we'd seen at Santos and Barcelona. The problem wasn't whether Neymar could still produce world-class football. It was whether PSG could keep him on the pitch long enough to matter. Then came 2020. For once, Neymar was fit when the Champions League reached its decisive stages. Against Atalanta in the quarter-final, PSG were heading out. Neymar kept demanding the ball, kept attacking, and helped create the late equalizer before PSG completed the comeback. They beat Leipzig in the semi-final. And for the first time in the club's history, Paris Saint-Germain reached the Champions League final. They lost 1-0 to Bayern Munich. But there's an uncomfortable fact for anyone who dismisses Neymar's entire PSG career as a failure. When PSG finally had him available deep into the Champions League, they went further than they'd ever gone before. And this wasn't only happening in Paris. Neymar's Brazil career had its own collection of brutal what-could-have-beens. At the 2014 World Cup, he'd scored 4 goals and helped take Brazil to the quarter-finals on home soil. Then Juan Zuniga's knee crashed into his back. Fractured vertebra. Tournament over. 4 years later, Neymar arrived at another World Cup shortly after returning from a major foot injury. Then came 2022. Brazil against Croatia. World Cup quarter-final. Extra time. Neymar tears through the Croatian defense and scores a magnificent goal. Brazil are minutes from the semi-final. Then Croatia equalize. Brazil lose on penalties. And suddenly another brilliant Neymar moment becomes another story about what might have been. That's where calling his career wasted becomes difficult. Neymar chose PSG. He made career decisions we can question. But he didn't choose a fractured back. He didn't choose broken bones in his foot. And he couldn't control Croatia equalizing minutes from the end. Without those moments, maybe Neymar's career looks completely different. Maybe it doesn't. We'll never know. But there's a danger in blaming everything on bad luck. Because some of the biggest decisions that shaped Neymar's career were entirely his own. Bad luck explains part of Neymar's career. It doesn't explain all of it. Because Neymar didn't choose to break his back. But he did choose to leave Barcelona. He chose PSG. And eventually, he chose to leave European football altogether. Those decisions have to be part of the verdict. At PSG, Neymar knew what he'd signed up for. The Champions League was the target. And once you become the most expensive footballer in history, everything you do gets judged differently. The parties, the arguments, the theatrics, the accusations of diving. Even his sister's birthday somehow became part of the annual Neymar conversation. Some of the criticism became ridiculous. But Neymar didn't always help himself either. That's part of what makes him such a fascinating footballer. The things people loved about Neymar were sometimes the same things they criticized. The swagger, the tricks, the personality, the refusal to behave like football had to be serious all the time. When you're winning, people call it charisma. When you're injured and your team is losing, they call it a lack of professionalism. And while everyone argued about Neymar, football began moving on. Messi and Ronaldo stayed at the top far longer than expected. Then Mbappé arrived. Holland followed. The generation Neymar was supposed to lead was suddenly becoming the generation passing him by. No Ballon d'Or. No second Champions League. And then, in 2023, Neymar made the hardest decision of all to defend. At 31, he left European football for Saudi Arabia. Al Hilal. Whatever you think about the PSG transfer, there was always a sporting argument for it. This was different. Neymar still had enough ability to play at the highest level. But he chose to walk away from European football. If you believe Neymar wasted part of his career, this is probably your strongest evidence. And then, almost unbelievably, his body intervened again. Just weeks into his Saudi career, while playing for Brazil against Uruguay, Neymar suffered the worst injury of his career. A torn ACL and meniscus. Months out. His time at Al Hilal barely got started. And eventually, Neymar went home. Back to Santos. Back to the club where this entire story began. But he returned with something strange following him. A Champions League winner. A Libertadores winner. A treble winner. Brazil's record goalscorer by his federation's count. One of the most gifted players of his generation. And somehow, still labeled a disappointment. Which leaves us with only one question. Did Neymar really waste his career? So, did Neymar really waste his career? I think there's a difference between saying Neymar could have achieved more, and saying he wasted what he had. Because look at what he actually did. He won the Copa Libertadores with Santos, the Champions League and treble with Barcelona. He twice finished third in the Ballon d'Or. He helped take PSG to their first Champions League final. And he became Brazil's record men's goalscorer by his federation's count. That's not a wasted career. But it isn't the career many people expected either. And perhaps that's the problem. Neymar reached his prime in the era of Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo. Two players who completely changed what we thought greatness looked like. 50 goals a season became normal. Ballon d'Or after Ballon d'Or. Champions League after Champions League. So when Neymar became one of the three best players in the world, we immediately asked why he wasn't number one. That's the standard his career has been judged against ever since. And Neymar deserves some responsibility for falling short of it. Leaving Barcelona changed his trajectory. Going to PSG was his choice. Leaving Europe at 31 was his choice. Maybe different decisions produce another Champions League. Maybe even a Ballon d'Or. We'll never know. But the other side matters too. The fractured back. The broken feet. The ankle injuries. The torn ACL. Those weren't choices. So my verdict? Neymar didn't waste his career. He probably didn't maximize it either. And those are two very different things. A genuinely wasted talent never becomes what Neymar became. We saw him reach the very top. We saw him decide Champions League matches. We saw him stand alongside Messi and Ronaldo. We saw the footballer everyone had been promised. We just didn't see him there for as long as we expected. Now Neymar is back at Santos. Back in the same white shirt where the world first discovered him. And maybe when his career is finally over, we'll stop obsessing over the player Neymar could have been. And appreciate the extraordinary player he actually was. Football remembers moments. History remembers icons.